Tonight, we step into the gaslit streets of Toronto in 1919, a city buzzing with ambition, theater lights, and whispers of fortune and betrayal. In a grand Elm Street mansion, Ambrose Small counted the day's earnings, a fortune so vast it could disappear into shadows and never be seen again. But by midnight, the lights went out in his office. The ledgers lay open and unfinished, and Ambrose Small himself was gone. Not a scream, not a struggle, just absence. The doors were locked, the money vanished, and the city awoke to a question that would haunt it for decades. Where did Ambrose Small go? Police called it a disappearance. Toronto called it a mystery. And over a century later, we're still tracing the empty footprints he left behind. Rain hammered against the windows of Grand Opera House office, a relentless percussion that seemed almost accusatory. Ambrose Small's desk was immaculate, as if he had never touched a pen that morning, yet the ledger lying open before him held a chilling silence. Entries that ended abruptly mid-thought, like a scream cut off by darkness. The last thing he wrote was cryptic, almost maddeningly banal. All payment accounted for. Everything will be settled tonight. And then nothing. No signature. No farewell. Just a quiet menace of ink drying on paper in a room that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and expensive cologne. The story doesn't begin in a dramatic struggle with a bloody scene or a door kicked down. No, it begins with the absence, that hollow void where a man should be. Ambrose Small vanished, without so much as a hint to anyone outside his inner circle. But, and this is what curls a spine, the night he disappeared, a staggering sum of money had just been collected from every theater under his control. $500,000 in cash, gold coins, promissory notes, the kind of fortune that could disappear into a fold, a river, or a basement, leaving only echoes. And yet, the ledger claimed all was reconciled. Perfectly neat, perfectly absurd. Staff reported nothing unusual that evening. Maids heard footsteps in the corridors. A secretary thought she saw his shadow move past the office window. Yet when morning came, the man himself was gone. Chairs were still pushed in. The safe was locked. The money was missing. Only a single coat, draped over a chair as if Ambrose had merely stepped out for a stroll, suggested he had ever been there at all. There were whispers of betrayal, of threats, of financial ruin and revenge. But these were whispers in the theater of shadows, where each echo seemed louder than the last. Letters were found, unopened, some containing personal secrets, others mundane correspondences with lawyers and performers. None provided clarity. Each seemed to taunt the investigators. You think you know, you don't even see the half of it. Even more bizarre, local newspapers ran stories of sightings. A man matching Small's description seen walking along the Don River, waiting at train stations, even entering a theater in the dead of night. None were verified. None lasted more than a day. And the public, already fascinated with the flamboyant theatrical impresario, became obsessed with speculation. Murder, kidnapping, escape, suicide, or a cunning self-imposed exile. Every theory seemed simultaneously plausible and grotesquely inadequate. Tonight, when you think of Ambrose Small, picture that desk. Picture the ledger. The clean room where nothing happened, except the disappearance of a man, a fortune, and any trace of certainty. That is where the horror begins, not in gore or screams, but in the cruel absence of proof, in the whispered insinuations that someone, somewhere, knows the truth but will never speak. It is a story of wealth, obsession, and darkness folded into the ordinary night. The kind of night where even your own reflection might vanish if you stare too long. Type continue to get the next part of the script. Toronto, 1919. The city was a restless symphony of post-war ambition, prohibition murmurs, and the grinding engines of industry. Cobblestones glistened under gas lamps, and streetcars rattled along Queen Street like nervous ticks of a clock, counting down to something everyone felt but no one named. The Great War had ended only a year prior, leaving a population scarred, wary, and hungry for spectacle. It was a perfect environment for a man like Ambrose Small, brilliant, theatrical, and slightly unhinged in the kind of way that makes ordinary people both admire and fear him. Theaters weren't just entertainment. They were temples of illusion and escape. Audiences flocked to see operas, vaudeville acts, and melodramas, leaving behind the way of a world just barely learning to breathe again. And Small controlled these temples, not by mere ownership, but by a charismatic command that made actors, ticket agents, and patrons alike feel he was a heartbeat of the city. He was everywhere, yet somehow untouchable, a puppet master whose strings glimmered like silver threads under the stage lights. Money flowed through his hands as if he were some sort of magician conjuring it from thin air. Theater owners whispered that Small had an eye for risk and a taste for opulence. He collected debts with a precision that was almost surgical, yet he spent extravagantly, throwing parties where champagne bubbled like laughter itself and performers were dazzled into loyalty or fear. And yet, beneath this veneer of wealth and spectacle, there were shadows. Stories of vanished employees, odd accidents backstage, and rumors of secretive dealings in the dark corners of Toronto circulated quietly. The kind of stories that made even seasoned journalists hesitate before asking questions aloud. Small's empire was as brittle as it was grand, and anyone who lived too close to it sometimes discovered that glitter has a sharp edge. The city itself seemed to conspire with the mystery. Narrow alleys, fog that rolled off the Don River, and the electric hum of streetcars at midnight created a landscape that was at once ordinary and deeply, subtly sinister. Crime was often dismissed as unfortunate coincidence, or as the inevitable byproduct of a metropolis still learning how to contain its own ambition. But for Ambrose Small, these conditions were both playground and trap. He walked streets where danger and opportunity danced cheek to cheek, and no one could predict which would claim him. Toronto in 1919 was more than a backdrop. It was a character in the story, its gaslit nights echoing the tension, its theaters housing illusions and secrets alike. Small didn't just thrive here. He defined the city's pulse, the heartbeat that would eventually skip, leaving a void both terrifying and hypnotic in its aftermath. Ambrose Small was not a man to be described easily. To call him ambitious would be like calling Niagara Falls a puddle. He was a storm in tailored suits, a genius with the audacity to imagine theater as both business and obsession. His charm was the kind that made you forget time existed. He could talk a man into signing over a building or a performer into risking everything on a single role, and all with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Those eyes, sharp and calculating, hinted at a mind always measuring, always scheming. Yet somehow he carried it all off as effortless grace. Born into modest circumstances, Small clawed his way into Toronto's theatrical elite through a mixture of savvy audacity and perhaps a touch of ruthlessness that people whispered about but never quite proved. He had the uncanny ability to sense human weakness and ambition alike, to read the cracks in character as though they were braille. Some called him a visionary, others, quietly, a predator. But everyone agreed he was intoxicating and impossible to ignore. He loved money, not quietly, not discreetly, but as if it were a living thing that responded to flattery and attention. But unlike ordinary tycoons, he also loved the theater itself, not just as profit, but as a breathing organism. Every stage, every curtain, every faint smell of grease paint and dust was sacred to him. That devotion made him brilliant, terrifying, and entirely unpredictable. You never knew whether you were witnessing art or madness, or both folded together in the same performance. And yet, despite his public persona, there were fissures in his life that few saw. Small had enemies, though they were careful to remain invisible. His financial dealings were labyrinthine, opaque enough to hide fraud, debts, and whispered threats. His personal life, too, was murky. Late-night rendezvous, hushed phone calls, letters that vanished before delivery. Even those closest to him admitted they sometimes felt as though they were sharing a house with a stranger masquerading as a man. By the spring of 1919, Small's reputation was nearly legendary. Wealthy, feared, admired, and envied in equal measure, he was a kind of figure whose presence alone could electrify a room, or drain it of certainty. People didn't just follow him, They became invested in him, in the danger and brilliance of watching a man who seemed to live outside the rules. And that is what makes the story so unsettling. This wasn't just a disappearance of money or a criminal act. It was a vanishing of a force of nature, a human hurricane that left only silence in its wake, and the city around him trembling to understand how one man could simply cease to exist. The evening of December 2nd, 1919, began like any other for Ambrose Small. He received payment from his theaters, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and negotiable notes, and watched the ledgers balance with that faint, manic satisfaction that only accountants or madmen can understand. He dined quietly at his home on Elm Street, reportedly in a cheerful mood, joking with servants, hinting at plans for new productions, speaking as if the world itself had no shadows that could reach him. And yet, as the night deepened, the first ripples of something unthinkable began to stir. At around 11 p.m., Small was last seen by his secretary, a young woman who swore she left him at his desk, tidying papers, sipping brandy, and promising to review contracts the next morning. No argument, no ominous warning, no strange behavior, just the ordinary cadence of a man absorbed in business. By midnight, however, the house was eerily quiet. The servants reported nothing unusual. No voices, no doors opening, no sign that anyone had entered or left. Small had vanished. The first disturbance was a scream or a shattered window. It was a quiet alarm, the kind that creeps in unnoticed until it's nearly too late. Chairs were in place. The fire was still warm. His coat hung neatly over the parlor chair, as if he had merely stepped out for a stroll. And yet, Ambrose Small was gone. The money he had collected? Missing. Not a trace. The locks were intact. Nothing indicated a forced entry. Neighbors were the first to whisper unease, reporting seeing shadows moving behind curtained windows, a single figure pacing near the Don River, or lights flickering in the otherwise empty house. Some swore they saw him walking down streets at odd hours. Though such sightings were fleeting, impossible to confirm. Rumors, yes, but rumors that carried the weight of a man whose disappearance didn't just disturb a household. It shook the city itself. Within hours, police were summoned, and the first reports of panic surfaced. The initial investigation turned up nothing concrete, only small, inexplicable anomalies. Letters left unopened, furniture slightly out of place, and the safe containing the collective fortune locked tight. This was no ordinary disappearance. It was precise, deliberate, and unervingly neat, the kind that seemed choreographed by a mind capable of extraordinary foresight, or by someone who understood the terrifying power of absence. Toronto's theater community, his world, his domain, was thrown into frenzied speculation. Actors and managers whispered of rivalries, debts, and revenge plots. Some feared he had been kidnapped. Others worried he had staged his own disappearance, a final, elaborate act of control over a world that had begun to feel too small for him. And in the shadowed corners of the city, where gossip flows like a river, one truth began to emerge. Ambrose Small's disappearance was no accident. Something had shifted, and the calm, ordered world of the impresario had collapsed in a single, quiet night. By morning, Toronto was buzzing, and not with the usual excitement of theater openings or political squabbles. The city was alive with a question that would haunt it for months. Where is Ambrose Small? The first reports to the press were cautious, almost polite in tone, but the public didn't care for caution. Headlines demanded drama, and newspapers delivered speculation faster than facts could arrive. Millionaire theater owner vanishes. Toronto's greatest mystery. The city devoured every whisper, every supposed sighting, every half-truth. And then the contradictions began. Witnesses claimed seeing Small near the Don River, but others insisted he was spotted entering a downtown theater with an unidentified man. A taxi driver swore he picked him up that night, while a delivery boy insisted Small had never left Elm Street. Each account carried conviction, yet none could be verified. It was as if the city itself were conspiring to scatter the truth, offering fragments of reality that clashed violently, leaving only confusion and obsession in their wake. Even the ledger, the neat, haunting document from his office, offered no comfort. Some pages were carefully annotated, some smudged as though rubbed by frantic hands. Some entries suggested meticulous planning, hinting at transactions and deals that might explain the fortune or its disappearance. And yet, nothing indicated any plan for Small himself. If he had vanished intentionally, he left no trail. If he had been taken, there was no sign, no evidence of struggle. It was a perfect absence, and that perfection made people uneasy in ways they couldn't articulate. Rumors swirled like fog over Toronto's streets. Was it a kidnapping? A revenge killing? A desperate act of fraud? Or had Small orchestrated the entire affair to escape the scrutiny, debt, or enemies that inevitably accumulate around a man of his ambition? Some whispered of family disputes, others of criminal underworld dealings, or a rival impresario too cunning to resist temptation. Each theory seemed plausible in isolation and absurd in combination, leaving detectives and journalists alike grasping at straws. Even law enforcement, the bastion of certainty, faltered. Police were met with confusion, conflicting statements, and an atmosphere thick with fear and fascination. Theaters were searched, offices ransacked, and every social contact examined. Yet, for all their effort, every path led to a dead end. Toronto, a city normally grounded in rules and schedules, felt like a dream distorted by a fever. Streets familiar yet suddenly sinister, faces friendly yet suddenly suspect. As the days passed, the mystery deepened. Not only had a man disappeared, but he had done so leaving behind a void in the city's psyche, a psychological wound that grew with every new rumor. People stopped sleeping well. Theater managers spoke in hushed tones. Children asked their parents questions that had no answers. And above it all, the question lingered, insistent and maddening. Who would benefit from Ambrose Small's vanishing? And why did it feel like he was still watching us, even in absence? The investigation into Ambrose Small's disappearance was a spectacle in itself, a grotesque theater of its own, with detectives playing the parts of confused actors and the city as audience. Police Chief John Brennan led the official inquiry, though he quickly realized that authority alone could not untangle this web. Witnesses were contradictory. Evidence was either missing or deliberately misleading, and every door they knocked on seemed to creak open into a shadowed hallway of suspicion. Small's family and staff were questioned exhaustively. His wife, Teresa, a woman of composure bordering on icy calculation, offered statements that were precise but curiously unemotional. Servants remembered the ordinary. Meals served, letters filed, coal stokers stoking. None reported anything suspicious. Yet even this mundane testimony carried undertones that gnawed at investigators. A missing smile here, a hesitant glance there, a detail that seemed minor until considered in the grander, maddening pattern of absence. The money, or its vanishing, became central to every theory. $500,000 in 1919 was not merely fortune. It was the kind of wealth capable of sustaining a small army or corrupting the entire city government. Some suggested that Small had staged the disappearance to abscond with the funds, disappearing into anonymity or across borders. Others posited a brazen crime, rival theater owners, disgruntled employees, or criminal gangs orchestrating a theft so audacious it will become legendary. Each theory had advocates, each had detractors, and none offered definitive proof. Then there were the darker, more obscure speculations. Journalists whisper about occult societies, about secret meetings in the dead of night, about hidden tunnels beneath the theaters where Small conducted affairs too private to understand. While sensationalized, these rumors reflected the palpable unease Small's life had inspired. A man whose very charisma blurred the lines between brilliance and menace, leaving others desperate to assign meaning to an event that refused to conform. Key clues were overlooked or dismissed, such as the partial fingerprint found on a theater ledger, or the anonymous letters sent to city officials claiming knowledge of Small's fate. There was a curious note found in his office safe, the ink smudged as though written in a hurry. Trust no one. Investigators pondered whether this was a final warning, a cryptic confession, or nothing at all. And yet, each discarded clue carried weight in the minds of those obsessed with the case. fueling speculation and paranoia in equal measure. By the time weeks had passed, the investigation became less about finding Small and more about charting the psychological landscape of Toronto itself. A city captivated by disappearance, seduced by mystery, terrified by the notion that a man could vanish without trace, and powerless to understand why. Theories multiplied like spores in damp corners, logical, irrational, and downright sinister. But the truth remained as elusive as Small himself, a ghost haunting the memory of a city unwilling to let him go. Then, weeks into the investigation, something unprecedented happened. A break that wasn't a break at all. A man came forward, his face pale, hands trembling like autumn leaves in a storm, claiming he had seen Small alive, boarding a train out of Toronto, destination unknown. The police were ecstatic, the newspapers jubilant, and the city collectively exhaled, only to realize a day later that the man's story changed with every telling. 1 hour Small was calm, composed, reading a newspaper. The next, he was frantic, muttering about debts and enemies. The inconsistencies shattered confidence, and the investigation fell into chaos. Then came the letters typed and signed, arriving in envelopes that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and something metallic. Each letter hinted at Small's fate. Each contradicted the last, and all were postmarked from within the city. Investigators followed the paper trails through printing shops, theaters, and offices, yet every path led to dead ends, abandoned buildings, or people who claimed ignorance. Somewhere between bureaucracy and madness, the search for Ambrose Small transformed from law enforcement into a psychological experiment. How far could a city chase its own shadow before succumbing to panic? The most dramatic twist arrived when a supposedly loyal employee confessed. Not to knowing where Small was, but to falsifying ledgers and siphoning funds in the days preceding the disappearance. This revelation suggested the possibility of betrayal, yet it provided no answers. The employee's story was half-truth, half self-preservation, leaving detectives to wonder whether they were uncovering fact or being manipulated by a man or a system, far smarter than they imagined. And then there was the theater itself. On a cold, fog-choked morning, someone discovered a series of small, meticulously arranged clues backstage. A ledger with pages torn and reordered, a ledger pen wiped clean except for faint smudges, a single shoe placed in a corner as if deliberately left. Were these the breadcrumbs of a clever escape, or the leftover artifice of a crime orchestrated with surgical precision? No one could tell. Each piece added tension, a narrative almost theatrical in its perversity, suggesting that Small's disappearance was designed to be unsolvable, or at least unsolved in a way that humiliated anyone daring to try. By this point, the case was no longer linear. It was spiraling. Investigators, journalists, and citizens alike became trapped in the vortex of contradiction, obsession, and speculation. The turning point wasn't discovery. It was a realization that clarity might never arrive. The law, reason, and even intuition were powerless against a disappearance that was, in its essence, a performance, a human vanishing act executed on a citywide stage, leaving only questions that clawed at the edges of sanity. In the end, there was no resolution, at least none that satisfied reason. Toronto waited for answers, clinging to every rumor, every supposed sighting, every whispered confession, yet the truth remained maddeningly out of reach. Officially, the case was closed. Ambrose Small was declared missing, presumed dead, and the missing fortune vanished. Investigators issued reports filled with conjecture and polite phrasing, careful to avoid claiming knowledge they didn't possess. But the city, hungry for certainty, knew better. The air was thick with suspicion, and nearly every corner held a shadow in which Small, or someone like him, might still be lurking. Speculation never died. Some insisted Small had been murdered, perhaps for money, perhaps for revenge, perhaps in a scheme too elaborate for anyone to untangle. Others argued he staged the disappearance himself, slipping quietly into anonymity with a fortune that would fund a new life far from Toronto, his own personal vanishing act, a defiance of both law and mortality. Still others whispered of blackmail, of secret societies, of debts so vast and intricate they could only be settled in silence. Each theory fit a piece of the puzzle and left the rest to rot in shadows. The lingering questions were grotesquely simple. Who profited? Who lied? Who saw more than they admitted? And above all was Ambrose Small. Even today, over a century later, historians debate. Some point to cryptic letters and signed documents or financial records as clues. Others examine patterns of movement, sightings, and behavior to construct plausible theories. None are conclusive. The facts that exist are a mosaic of absence, a ledger, a coat, a fortune evaporated, and a city left scrambling for meaning. The case's unresolved nature has a peculiar resonance. It is less a story of crime and more a study of human obsession, of our need to impose order on chaos. Toronto itself became a character, haunted by a disappearance that violated expectations, tore at certainties, and mocked authority. To this day, the tale of Ambrose Small serves as a reminder that some mysteries are crafted with deliberate intent, to baffle, to confound, and perhaps to endure. And yet, despite decades of scrutiny, the record remains stubbornly silent. There is no confession, no body, no definitive trail. Only traces, small anomalies, cryptic statements, vanished wealth, and a question that refuses to fade. How does a man, so prominent, so watched, simply cease to exist? The answer lies somewhere in the interplay between ambition, deception, and human psychology, but the precise location, the final moment, remains forever obscured, a gaping void in the historical record, tantalizing and terrifying in equal measure. The disappearance of Ambrose Small didn't just leave a hole in a ledger. It tore a hole in Toronto itself. Theaters he controlled floundered, some collapsing entirely, leaving performers out in the cold, their careers dangling like ornaments cut from a tree. Staff scattered, some under suspicion, others under shame, and the city watched in a mixture of fascination and horror as the empire of a single man unraveled like a badly woven tapestry. Money evaporated, reputations were questioned, and people began to understand that wealth, power, and charm, no matter how dazzling, could be instruments of both creation and destruction. Teresa Small, his widow, became a figure both pitiful and enigmatic. She was left with half-empty estates, unanswered letters, and a public hungry for scandal. In interviews, she spoke with the precision of someone who had learned early that words could protect as much as they could betray. But behind the composed demeanor, a psychological fracture remained. Reports suggest she suffered insomnia, a gnawing fear and fixation on the vanished fortune, which seemed to haunt her home like a specter no exorcism could touch. The police, embarrassed and frustrated, faced criticism for the failure to resolve the case. Their methods, while modern for the era, were inadequate against the cunning, or perhaps the luck, that had allowed a man and a fortune to vanish without a trace. Detectives who worked on the case carried it with them for years, their careers marked by this singular, confounding failure. Some were haunted by the thought that the truth had been there, right in front of them, but obscured by misdirection, human error, or sheer audacity. Culturally, the disappearance left an imprint on the city's psyche. It became a cautionary tale whispered in theaters, office corridors, and at dinner tables. Ambition unchecked can vanish. Fortunes can evaporate, and humans, no matter how brilliant or flamboyant, can be reduced to myths. Authors, journalists, and playwrights drew inspiration from the case, weaving it into fiction, exaggerating and mythologizing, but the reality, the ledger, the coat, the unanswered letters, remain stubbornly more bizarre than fiction ever could. Even today, more than a century later, Small's story functions as a lens on obsession, secrecy, and the fragility of human control. It reminds us that societies are ill-equipped to handle absolute uncertainty, that fortune attracts peril as surely as it dazzles, and that some people can disappear so completely. They are remembered more vividly in absence than in presence. Ambrose Small did not just vanish physically. He vanished psychologically, leaving a void in which the city, the public, and history itself are still trying to orient themselves. There's a perversely poetic cruelty in Ambrose Small's disappearance. A man who controlled stages, audiences, and even the very perception of reality in Toronto managed, In the end, to become the ultimate illusion himself, he turned absence into art, leaving behind only traces: an abandoned coat, a ledger with neat lines of ink, a fortune evaporated, and in doing so, forced the city to confront the fragile certainty of its own understanding. Reality, it seemed, could be rewritten with a few carefully orchestrated choices. Imagine, for a moment, the psychological weight of this for those left behind. Teresa Small, alone with unanswered letters. Employees, forever uncertain if loyalty or betrayal had cost them everything. Detectives, haunted by the notion that every lead might have been a carefully crafted deception. The disappearance wasn't just a criminal case. It was a masterclass in manipulation, perception, and the terror of incompleteness. Humans crave closure, but here, closure was denied with surgical precision, leaving the city trapped in collective cognitive dissonance. And then there's a fortune, the grotesque, tantalizing element that never ceases to stir the imagination. $500,000 in cash. Gone. Gold coins, promissory notes. The kind of wealth that could vanish into a river or a hidden room and remain untouched for decades. Whoever claimed it, if anyone did, participated in a narrative so daring that it borders on admiration. The audacity to abscond with not only money but the attention and obsession of an entire metropolis. There's a darkly ironic elegance in that. The more you dig, the stranger it gets. Small was a man of theatrical genius, psychological insight, and obsessive control over his world. Yet in the end, the one thing he could not control was interpretation. Every theory, every rumor, every story becomes part of the myth. And in that myth, half horror, half fascination, he lives more vividly than most do in life. People remember him not as a man, but as an event, a vanishing that refuses to settle into narrative simplicity. Perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: somewhere, someone may know the truth. Perhaps Small orchestrated entirely. Perhaps he was betrayed. Perhaps he was eliminated. But the truth, however mundane or spectacular, is secondary to the terror of uncertainty. Ambrose Small didn't just disappear. He created a void in which history itself trembles, reminding us that sometimes the darkest stories are not about murder or theft, but about absence, ambiguity, and the horrifying human desire to know what cannot be known. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.